I've always believed that hiking is the perfect cure for the sickness of city life. A long trek, especially a solo one, allows you to find a sense of inner peace in the sound of the wind and your own breathing. That fall, I took a week off work to challenge a new trail I'd been eyeing for a while. It was deep in a national park, rarely traveled. On the first afternoon, I walked the leaf-strewn path with my pack on my back, the cool air invigorating, surrounded by nothing but the chirping of birds and the rustle of wind through the pines. As the sun began to set, I found a perfect campsite, a small, flat clearing bordered by a stream. At that moment, I thought it was paradise. I had just finished setting up my one-man tent and was preparing to start a fire when I noticed something strange. Hanging from a low branch just above me, tied with a piece of twine, was a small object. It was a crudely carved human figure, made from a twig, with twisted limbs and no facial features. It hung there silently, swaying gently in the breeze. This wasn't the kind of trail marker a normal hiker would leave. It felt more like a twisted joke. A flicker of unease passed through me, as if it had spoiled the tranquility of the place. I stood up, untied it, and shoved it into the pocket of my jacket without a second thought. Night fell quickly. I sat before my campfire, watching the water boil in my pot, the world around me completely swallowed by darkness. Only the small area illuminated by the fire felt safe. Just then, from the dense woods to my right, I heard a sharp crack, the sound of a dry branch being snapped underfoot. My nerves tightened instantly. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, thinking it might be another camper. The forest was dead silent. There was no reply. I frowned, a knot forming in my stomach. A few minutes later, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined it, I caught a flicker of a flashlight beam in my peripheral vision. It cut through the trees far in the distance, then was extinguished just as quickly. I knew for sure then. Someone was out there. And they had heard me, but chosen not to answer. A specific kind of chill crawled up my spine. I immediately put out my fire, packed away all my food, and scrambled into my tent, zipping every zipper tightly. I took my sharp hiking knife out of my pack and held it firmly in my hand. I lay in the dark tent for nearly an hour, straining my ears for any sound, but there was nothing but the wind. Just as I began to relax, thinking the person had moved on, I heard a noise that made my heart stop. It was the sound of footsteps. They were slow and light, circling my tent, step by step. I could feel with absolute clarity that someone was silently examining my small, fragile shelter. My breathing stopped. Suddenly, the footsteps halted right at the side of my tent where the zipper was. I was frozen, unable to move. The next second, a hand pressed firmly against the tent fabric. The silhouette of 5 fingers was clearly visible in the faint moonlight, just inches from my face. Before I could even scream, a cold gleam of light flashed. With a tearing sound, a knife sliced right through the tent wall, the tip grazing my scalp as it cut a long gash in the fabric. In that instant, terror turned into pure survival instinct. I let out a guttural roar, kicked out with all my might toward the handprint, and simultaneously thrust my own knife back through the gash that had just been cut. I felt the tip of my blade sink into something soft, and a muffled grunt came from outside the tent. I didn't hesitate for a second. I tore open the other side of the tent and scrambled out, rolling onto the cold ground. I abandoned all my gear and ran blindly into the pitch-black forest. I could hear him crashing through the undergrowth behind me, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls like a drumbeat of doom. I don't know how long I ran. Branches whipped at my face, leaving stinging cuts, and my lungs burned. I didn't stop until the sounds of pursuit finally faded, and I collapsed from exhaustion at the base of a large tree. I spent that night huddled against the tree roots, lost in a state of cold, abject terror. At first light, I got my bearings and began the grueling, day-long hike back to my car. I drove straight to the park ranger station and reported the attack. They were concerned, but also skeptical. They sent a team to my campsite, but they found it completely empty. My tent, my gear, everything was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. The incident eventually became an unresolved case file. Weeks later, when I had finally begun to recover from the trauma, I was getting ready to wash the jacket I had worn during my escape. As I emptied the pockets, my fingers closed around the forgotten, crudely carved wooden figure. This time, under the bright light of my apartment, I turned it over in my hand. On its back, nearly too small to see, was a set of characters scratched into the wood with the tip of a knife. It was a date, the exact date of my attack. And next to it, there was a number, 12. The blood froze in my veins. I wasn't the first. This wasn't a random attack. I had stumbled into the hunting ground of a predator who enjoyed this, and that grotesque figure hanging in the trees was his cold, silent tombstone, left for his prey. My name is Sarah. Last autumn, I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin in the woods. I needed to escape the city's hustle and bustle and find a quiet place to write. The cabin looked charming online, rustic yet modern. I arrived in the late afternoon, unpacked, and savored the long-lost tranquility. Although it felt a bit isolated, I truly enjoyed the solitude. Soon after settling in, I heard some faint creaks, which I attributed to an old house settling or the wind. As dusk fell, I went for a walk. I noticed a barely visible, very faint path leading off the main track and deeper into the forest, not marked on any map. A flicker of unease crossed my mind. Back at the cabin, while I was cooking, I glimpsed something moving at the edge of the tree-line, far in the distance. I assumed it was some kind of animal. Later, I found a small, smooth gray stone on the porch railing that hadn't been there before. It looked out of place. A shiver ran down my spine. As night deepened, the creaking sounds around the cabin became clearer and closer. It sounded like footsteps, first on the porch, then approaching a window. I peered through the blinds, but saw nothing but shadows. I checked all the locks, my stomach nodding. Not long after, I walked out to the porch again, and found the small stone had vanished from the railing. In its place, a new, slightly larger, darker stone was placed directly in front of the main door, like a marker. I also found a freshly cut small branch, about a foot long, leaning against the back door. It looked like it had been deliberately placed there. I felt watched. I started leaving all the lights on, even in rooms I wasn't in. Around midnight, a storm suddenly hit, pouring rain and howling wind. The lights flickered a few times. Then a loud, deliberate thud came from the back door. It wasn't the wind. I froze, my heart pounding. I heard a scraping sound, like metal against wood, right near the doorknob. Someone was trying to pry the door open. I grabbed the heaviest thing in the kitchen, a cast iron skillet. The door shuddered again, with a louder splintering sound. The door frame was cracking. I heard a low, guttural grunt from outside. Then, the distinct sounds of wood shattering and the lock breaking. The back door began to slowly push inward. A dark, bulky silhouette started to emerge in the gap. Adrenaline surged. I screamed a raw, guttural sound and blindly swung the skillet towards the opening. I heard a sharp yelp of pain, and the figure recoiled slightly. Without thinking, I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the latch. I heard heavy footsteps behind me fast. Just as I flung the front door open, I felt a hand brush my hair, almost grabbing me. I burst out into the pouring rain barefoot and ran without looking back towards my car parked a short distance away. I scrambled inside, locked the doors, started the engine, and sped down the long, dark driveway. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town and found a gas station, where I called 911. The police arrived and took my statement. I went back to the cabin with them. The back door had indeed been forced open, with splintered wood and clear signs of a struggle. No one was found inside or nearby. A detective pointed to the dark stone near the front door. We found several of these stones around the property, varying in size. There were also some small, cut branches near the windows. Then he showed me something else, a tiny, almost invisible camera, disguised as a birdhouse, hidden in a tree overlooking the cabin's porch. "Ma'am, it looks like you've been watched for a while. These things, they're markers. And this camera, it's been active for at least a week, maybe longer." The truth hit me like a physical blow, leaving me dizzy. This wasn't random. Someone had been observing me, planning this. The solitude I craved had become a trap. I never returned to that cabin. The quiet dread of being watched, of someone knowing my every move, still haunts me. That dark stone, a silent countdown, is etched deep in my memory. Three days after Hurricane Isaac, the world smelled like wet pine needles and mud. My family was lucky. Our house was at the end of a small road, surrounded by dense woods. The tall pines had blocked most of the wind. Besides a few broken windows and a trashed yard, the house itself was fine. The only problem was the power outage. The electric company said it could be a week or two. My name is Amy. I was 22 that year, home from college for the summer. My parents had to go to another city for work right before the storm hit. They were supposed to be back the next day, but the floods washed out the main bridge, trapping them. They'd be gone for at least a week. So, it was just me in the house. At first, I wasn't scared. Our area was safe, and all the neighbors knew each other. After the hurricane, everything was unnaturally quiet. No cars, no humming air conditioners, just the rustle of wind through damp leaves. At night, I used candles and a flashlight to read, listening to a battery-powered radio. It felt like some kind of retro camping trip. That night, around 9 o'clock, I was reading in the living room, the candlelight throwing dancing shadows on the walls. That's when I heard the first strange sound. It was a very faint scraping noise, coming from the back of the house. It sounded like a tree branch dragging against the wooden siding. I didn't think much of it. The yard was littered with broken branches. I went back to my book, but a few minutes later, the sound came again. This time it was clearer, like someone was lightly dragging their fingernails across the kitchen back door. I put my book down, my heart starting to pound. "Don't be stupid, Amy," I told myself. It was probably just a raccoon or some other animal rummaging around on the porch. To calm myself down, I grabbed my heavy metal flashlight and tiptoed toward the kitchen. The kitchen was pitch black, except for a few weak silver slivers of moonlight coming through the window. I crept closer to the back door and pressed my ear against it, listening. Outside, there was dead silence. I let out a breath, feeling a little foolish. Maybe I had imagined it. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a distinct metallic click. It was the sound of the doorknob turning. Someone was outside, and they were trying to open my door. An icy wave of fear washed over me. I stood frozen in the darkness, holding my breath. My mind went blank, filled only by the sound of that doorknob turning, slow and deliberate. Click, clack, click. He was patient. I forced myself to move. I didn't turn on any lights. Instead, I backed quietly into the hallway, pressing my body flat against the wall. What could I do? Call the police? I had no cell signal. Run to a neighbor's house? The closest one was through a patch of woods, and it was pitch black outside. That was too dangerous. My only option was to hide. I slipped into the coat closet at the end of the hall, the safest place I could think of. It had no windows and a heavy, solid door. I shut it as gently as I could, then crouched down behind a pile of winter coats, peering through the tiny crack between the door and the frame. I clutched the heavy flashlight in my hand, my only weapon. Minutes passed in total silence. I started to wonder if I'd misheard. Maybe the person had given up and left. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. Crack! It was the sound of breaking glass. He had smashed the small glass pane on the back door. My heart leaped into my throat, and my stomach churned. I heard him reach a hand through the broken pane, fumbling for the inside lock. Then, the sound of the deadbolt turning. The door swung open. I heard his footsteps in the kitchen. They were slow and heavy, his boots seeming to be caked in mud, leaving wet tracks on the linoleum. He made no noise, no calls for help, no words at all. He just moved through my house in silence. That silence was more terrifying than any threat. He wasn't a lost survivor looking for help. He was here for something else. Through the crack in the door, I saw a dark silhouette move through the faint moonlight. He was tall, wearing a dark, hooded sweatshirt that hid his face. He seemed to be holding something, but I couldn't make it out. He checked each room, one by one, with a methodical patience that felt predatory. He was getting closer. I could hear his heavy breathing now. Huddled behind the coats, I was shaking so hard I thought the whole closet would rattle. I clamped a hand over my mouth, terrified to make a sound. He reached the closet door. He stopped. Time seemed to freeze. I could feel his presence, his attention, right through the wood. He knew I was in here. He must have seen my candlelight from a window outside. Slowly, the doorknob began to turn. My mind went white. I knew in that instant that the moment he found me it would be over. My adrenaline surged and pure survival instinct took over. The second the door opened, I reacted. It was thrown open, his tall frame filling the doorway. As he looked down to where I was crouched, I swung the heavy flashlight with all the strength I had, right at his face. There was a sickening, dull thud as the metal hit his forehead. He let out a pained grunt and staggered back a step. It was my only chance. I scrambled past him like a wild animal, bursting out of the closet and sprinting for the back door he'd left open. I didn't look back, I just ran. I burst out into the cold, muddy backyard, my bare feet cut by rocks and twigs, but I felt no pain. I could hear him coming after me, his footsteps heavy and angry. I didn't dare look back. Using the weak moonlight to guide me, I just ran, stumbling through the debris toward my neighbor's house. When I finally reached their porch and started hammering on the door with my fists, I risked a single glance behind me. He was standing at the edge of the woods, a tall, dark silhouette, watching me. Then, he turned and vanished into the blackness. My neighbors were horrified by the state I was in and immediately pulled me inside and called the authorities. It took a long time for the police to arrive because of the road conditions. They searched my house, but the man was gone. On the kitchen floor, however, they found the backpack he'd dropped. It didn't contain food or water. Inside was a coil of thick rope, several bundles of zip ties, and a terrifyingly sharp hunting knife. The police told me that the chaos after a hurricane is the perfect hunting ground for a certain type of person. They use the isolation, the breakdown of communication and travel, to move through the darkness like predators.